Thank you for joining Fading Causes with me, Mukesh Kapila. In this episode, we dive deep into doing good to the world, especially when it doesn't want good done to it. And there can be no better person to discuss that than someone who has spent 30 years of his life at the coalface of development, crisis management, and humanitarian assistance. And is still at it as the UN resident and humanitarian coordinator for Ukraine. Welcome, Matthias Schmale.
Thank you, Mukesh, for this opportunity to have a chat.
Well, we've just had the General Assembly at the UN in New York. World leaders came, made speeches, had photo ops, and but the mood was distinctly glum, wasn't it? And certainly not celebratory, considering this is the 80th anniversary of the founding of the UN, with so many tragedies across the world, and plenty of questions about that go at the very core of what the UN is all about. Most serious of all, is the UN still relevant? Now, Matthias, you lead the United Nations in Ukraine, a very important zone for UN operations. But from the global perspective, why is the world so disappointed in the UN? How justified is that?
It's a good question, Mukesh, and I inevitably think of our member states that make up the United Nations and the Secretariat, the civil service that runs it. The disappointment is mainly with the member states that meet in the Security Council and the General Assembly. And in preparing for our chat, I took out the UN Charter again to remind myself what Article 1 says. And it's all about making peace and preventing and ending conflicts. And so I think that's where the disappointment comes from. If you look at all the major wars and conflicts of our time, whether it's here in Ukraine, Gaza, Sudan, the UN is evidently not at the center of negotiations and peacemaking. That's where the main disappointment comes from. I'd like to think that what we as the civil servants do, you were one once, is much more appreciated on the ground.
So it's the countries that go to war, and it's the countries that make peace, and the UN can only facilitate those efforts. But But yes, for many people, the UN appears vast, opaque, and distant. Do you think that's part of the problem? Why so many people have lost connection with the UN? What's the mood inside the UN system nowadays? And your thoughts on the best reforms so we can revitalize this organization and regain public confidence?
I cannot just point to the member states in terms of what is perceived wrong with the UN. Of course, the civil service, we are over 30,000 people in the Secretariat, plus people across the various agencies. There is something flawed there, and you've made a reference to it. We are celebrating 80 years of the United Nations this year, and we have become, as a bureaucracy, slightly stale. We need to look at how can we be more impactful. Now, a part of this is size, and we set up fit for purpose. Do we have too many people doing the same things? And there's an ongoing process, which the Secretary General has called UN 880, to look into reorganizing ourselves to be more impactful in terms of the resources we use, clarity of mandates, and so on. But I think there is, Mukesh, another side of it, and that is about trust in the institution. I remember the Secretary General Antonio Guterres say in his first year, and he repeats it from time to time, that all institutions suffer from a trust deficit, and the UN is no exception. I think reform is about regaining the trust of citizens. Another bit of the charter is it starts not with we, the member states, it starts with we, the peoples. And beyond institutional reform, efficiency gains, clarity of mandates, we need to get better at regaining the trust of citizens around the world that I think at the end of the day are our real constituency. And that requires dialogue and engagement and communication.
Now, Matthias, you are, of course, a good, faithful civil servant of the UN in Ukraine. How how do you feel day to day representing the United Nations with all the background we've just talked about? And how do you strive to build confidence and trust within your theater of operations in Ukraine?
You were once a resident coordinator and humanitarian coordinator in Sudan, so you know what I'm talking about. There are ups and downs almost on a daily basis. I take comfort from the delivery we do, especially in this country at war, along the frontline regions in the east. I travel a lot. I meet many people, citizens whom we support, that value what we do, basic humanitarian services and early recovery. So if that weren't there, I would be totally frustrated, to be frank. Our calling card in this country, like in others, is, as it were, our humanitarian and early recovery footprint. When I say there are downsides, I wish we would be more recognized also as a peacemaker. But that is evidently not the case. So also in Ukraine, I think we have established good relationships with the political leadership of this country, but we're not seen at the core of their efforts to defend the country and bring about peace. So that leaves us with all other stakeholders beyond maintaining good relations with government. What I try to do is engage with various groups. So, for example, young people. Next week, I will be in Kharkiv in the east for a full day at one of the main universities. And it will be a day of engaging with students and young people and entertaining their critical questions also. Social media is a big part. A colleague who's the resident coordinator in Pakistan said to me, if it's not on social media, it doesn't exist. I'm not sure I would go that far, but you do a lot of social media work. I think we inevitably have to. So it's physical meetings, but it's also engaging through modern means.
By the way, let me plug your Instagram account to our listeners. I actually follow what you are doing on Instagram, and no doubt that every day you're being extremely energetic in advancing the UN mission. But you talked about delivery of aid as being a principal instrument for maintaining confidence, trust, and connection with the people of Ukraine. Absolutely right, that is. But can the UN survive if the only and much battered calling card it has is humanitarian aid only?
That's a challenging, difficult question. This one is, I should have mentioned earlier, one of the calling cards we also have here is a human rights monitoring mission. A team of 70 people on the ground who do nothing else but document what they think are potential war crimes, because we cannot have accountability if war crimes aren't documented. But back to your question, I think I've shared this with you in one of our private conversations before. A few weeks ago, I had one of my confidential dialogue sessions with human rights-based organizations, Ukrainians. A young Ukrainian activist who's a historian asked me whether I had studied the downfall of the League of Nations. I said, no, why? And he said, maybe we are experiencing the downfall of the United Nations, and
Mhm.
maybe you should study what led to the downfall of your predecessor organization and to avoid the mistakes. I said, what you as a historian, what do you think? And he said, well, the League of Nations in his understanding was created to solve common problems. And when the member states realized it wasn't doing that, they gave it up. And he said, as a young Ukrainian, you might appreciate that if my expectation of the UN is it prevents wars, or when they happen, it helps solve them. And the UN is not doing that in my country. I have a lot of respect for what you do on the ground, for you personally, but the UN as an institution is failing us. And so if you don't find a way of getting back into the center of peacemaking and war prevention, the future of the UN is at risk. And I think he's right.
This brings us to a further thought. Your title is the resident and humanitarian coordinator. The word resident equates to the more development side of the job, and I see that you're wearing the SDG
Yeah.
wheel. Tell me, Matthias, from all your experience, past and now, where is your heart on the development side of the human improvement mission or the humanitarian side?
So again, two, three reflections, Mukesh. One is the title is meaningless to ordinary citizens. And when I talked earlier about we need to find ways of engaging with ordinary citizens and regaining trust. Part of it is language. We use abbreviations and language, including for our titles, that no ordinary person understands. My experience has been, and I think back of my previous job in Nigeria, what people can relate to is if I say I'm Guterres' ambassador in your country. That people can relate to. You represent someone. And people do appreciate when I explain the coordination comes from coordinating in Ukraine the 19 UN agencies that are here on the ground and coordinating as humanitarian coordinator the UN and almost 500 NGOs that are involved. So people get that if there's a large number of agencies doing humanitarian or development work, it's good to get that coordinated. My comms person often says, don't use the title coordinator. Just say you head the UN in Ukraine, because people can relate to that. You also asked, where's my heart in terms of humanitarian versus development? My boss on the development side, Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed, was very clear that I shouldn't get caught up 90 or 100% on the humanitarian side. I have a responsibility for the SDGs, and that needs to be balanced. Of course, in a country at war, the focus is inevitably on the humanitarian side. But there's actually, to my surprise, quite a bit of development work going on. If we're thinking about the future, about sustainability, about this country recovering one day, I think she is right in her advice to try and have my heart in both places, both the humanitarian and the development side.
I think you have a big heart, Matthias. I can attest to that from our past work together. But it does trigger a further question. That's the UN is pretty good at setting norms and it sets goals and targets. You know, if there's any problem in the world, the first thing the UN does is set a goal to improve it. And then it makes guidelines and writes manuals around it and such like. Now, coming to the Sustainable Development Goals 2030, far, far behind um, their achievement. I'm thinking globally now, let alone in conflict affected countries. Do you think we've had enough of these goal setting exercises and we need to pause and allow the world to catch up with the norms that the UN rightly promotes, but unfortunately the world cannot keep up?
Yeah, you more than I have been involved in the design of the MDGs and the SDGs, the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals. I think there is value in having a guiding framework for development. Looking at the SDGs, some of it is compelling, but how do normal citizens see us? It's too detailed of a framework. So that's one challenge. We need to find ways of interpreting this global development framework so it makes sense to people who need our support. And we have a challenge with some governments. In my time in Nigeria, actually, the Nigerian government was a fan of the SDGs, and it was easy to discuss that with them in terms of what's the UN bringing. Here in Ukraine, from the beginning, I've had the experience that political leaders, SDGs are for underdeveloped countries. We are a developed country, so leave us alone with that. Focus on the humanitarian side and recovery. For us, development means recovery. I'm generalizing a bit, but it speaks to your point. I think many member states now feel we should leave them alone with global agendas and really speak to what are the pressing issues of their time. On the normative side, I really think we have too many norms also. Every other week, there is a celebration of some convention or other. And I'm not arguing that the individual conventions, agreements to ban the use of landmines, the Convention for the Right of the Child are not important in their own right. But we have too many. I don't even know them all, if I'm perfectly frank. And I head the UN in Ukraine. So I think part of reforming the UN and the global normative side of this is we need to make this much more simple and understandable and relatable to specific situations. So I think our norms and guidelines need to be more guidance than prescriptive. I think the Charter, the Human Rights Charter, are two key documents. Sort of also back to basics. Let's have two or three that we really relate everything to and not hit the globe's population with the too many that we have.
Hmm. Going deeper into Ukraine, millions have been displaced and disrupted. I think the UN estimates $500 billion worth of damage, and I suspect that's an underestimate, and certainly the war continues. But yet, life also continues. And many refugees in the rest of Europe are returning to Ukraine, at least to some of the areas less affected. How is that? Give me a sense of what life is like for Ukrainians on a day to day basis as they go to the coffee houses, as they do their chores and daily jobs, even under bombardment and drone attacks. People talk about resilience, a term that I've heard so much over the last few years. It's overused, but what does it mean in the Ukrainian context?
I came here in August last year. There's no flights because of the war, so everything is done either by train or by car. A driver drove me in from Poland, and this Ukrainian driver said to me, Matthias, you will likely experience in Ukraine every day hell and heaven next to each other. And as we were driving in, I didn't fully appreciate that. My mindset was I was going to a country at war. I've been in other war situations, including Gaza. I didn't expect. But he was right, looking back over this year or plus, because here Kyiv is a bustling modern town when there are no sirens and no bombardments. Of course, when the sirens go off, and there are periods when that happens frequently, and when there are bombardments and strikes, of course, that's war and that is hell. But I have been here many mornings after a night of hell and strikes, and you mentioned coffee shops, and I see people just back to their normal life, including coffee shops. I sometimes, many times, see people continuing to have their coffee even when the sirens go off, because it's a very technologically advanced country. They have apps for all sorts of things, including tracking bombs and missiles. I was in a meeting with Ukrainian colleagues once, sirens went off. And they looked at their phones and then they said, don't worry, we don't need to go to the bunker. These are whatever it was. It's another part of the country. This is not going to hit us here. So there is, you mentioned resilience, Mukesh, like I sensed in your question. I don't really know what that means as a term. I experience resilience in the field, as we call it. So I remember going to Kherson once, the south, daily shelling. The governor told me recently the capital, Kherson city, hasn't had a single day this year without shelling. So above ground, you see the drama, the hell. Then they took me to an underground maternity ward, state of the art, financed by WHO and the EU. And it was this contrast of above ground, it looks like a partially deserted, destroyed place. Below ground, they're giving new life, birth to new life. That's resilience. In the same city and in other cities, I've gone to underground schools where, and again, some of them state of the art. I've never been in a school like that in terms of the equipment and so on, and committed teachers. So there's that bit. I also want to say, though, Mukesh, I think we shouldn't romanticize resilience. We are in year 4 of this, going to year 5. I've also experienced people who are getting tired, who are strong, but we should not romanticize this. It's an illusion to think people will stay strong forever through these horrors. So an example is I met an older man, older than me, in the oblast of Mykolaiv, who told me proudly at the beginning of our conversation how he stayed through Russian occupation of his village. And then when the Russians, as they say, deoccupied his village and his area, he stayed, rebuilt his house. And he spoke of that with strength. Then he recalled that his brother was killed in 2022. And he broke down. He had to leave the room and finish the conversation. The other day, last week, I was in Odessa talking to the humanitarian volunteer advisor to the mayor of Odessa. She told me with strength, one of these feisty young Ukrainian women who much more energetic than I'll ever be, doing humanitarian work day in, day out, and especially after strikes. So then she said, we're really grateful for the international community. And she started crying and had all of us in tears. So there are examples of this, and I think there is the strength, there is the resilience, but this country, like any other country that's experienced the horrors of war, take generations to deal with the psychological impact and mental health implications.
I think to be able to shed tears is an important part of the coping capacity or resilience or whatever you wish to call it. Now, you had the UN, and we all know what a big job that is. All I can remember when I was doing a job comparable to yours in Sudan, that I was totally not in control of myself. I mean, every minute of my day and night was basically set meetings, visits, emergencies of all sorts. And at night also, because as a designated security official, your phone was on all the time because somewhere something might happen. And then you would have obligation to look after the people affected, including your own staff. So you've already spoken a little bit about what you've been doing, but take us through a typical week of your diary. How do you organize yourself? And I hope there is space in that diary for a cup of coffee sometimes, and maybe some play if you have any time for that.
I don't know if you had that in your Sudan days. We have the so-called R&R, rest and relaxation system. The idea is we're here for 6 weeks, at least in Kyiv, the cycle is 6 weeks. And then we're entitled to a week outside to recover, to rest and recuperate. And that is for us internationals part of coping, because indeed, when you're here, it is full blast. There is hardly any space in the calendar. My executive associate who manages my calendar regularly tells me I need to put 15-minute slots in between your 8, 10 meetings a day so that you can recuperate. But, I often say as internationals, we are not forced to be here. It's a choice. We have systems that support us, including mental health access, support access. It's sort of work hard, play hard. Although my wife says she doesn't see the play hard because when I'm home, I sleep. And it's on a serious note, you may remember that from your days in the many emergencies you've been involved in. The adrenaline keeps you going, including having coffees once in a while. And you really only realize when you leave the country for rest and relaxation how draining it is. A typical work week is a mix of internal coordination meetings, the UN country team, the humanitarian country team, external engagements representing the Secretary General and the UN at large. Just this morning, I didn't know that existed, an International Day for Rural Women. And in Ukraine, agriculture plays a big part, and rural women are a big part of keeping agriculture going. So a day to commemorate them, to discuss with them what more can we do to keep them safe and resilient, to use that term again. So I spoke as ambassador of the UN. So there's quite a bit of speaking and representing, which are then also opportunities to hopefully in an intelligent way refer to the norms and standards that we spoke earlier. And then every second week I try to leave Kyiv because Kyiv is a bit of a bubble. And the reality, especially near the eastern front line, of course, is different the closer you get to it. A week ago, I was in Kramatorsk, which took us 4.5 hours to drive to. We had to meet the governor there underground in his bunker. We had a meeting with NGOs to discuss how can we support them doing very risky, heroic evacuations of vulnerable people from the front line and how we can then help them with that, keep them safe and the people they're evacuating. So Mukesh, I think it's a mix, as I'm sure it was for you in Sudan, of sort of the official side, the representing, the internal side, the too many coordination meetings, trying to herd the cats that are the UN and the humanitarian community. And then where I get most energy from is being out there, talking to people that do the delivery of vital aid and early recovery and the people we serve, because that's why we're here at the end of the day.
Well, just a few days ago, we were corresponding on WhatsApp, and at the same time, I was watching on television some bombs falling on Kharkiv or somewhere, and I knew that's where you were because that's what our messaging was about. And so, tell me, what's it like to be in that particular situation, often week after week, carrying on, obviously, but at the same time, the living and working under continuous threat. Does Mr. Putin have the GPS coordinates of your bedroom, for example?
I don't know if it goes to that detail, but we do use here what we call a humanitarian notification system. And until yesterday, and I'll tell you why, I thought that's working. What we do is we've organized hundreds of so-called interagency convoys to bring essential goods, humanitarian goods, food, water, medicine, hygiene kits into frontline areas where about 500,000 or so vulnerable people remain. Each time we do this, we notify the Ukrainians, we notify the Russians. The Russians say, stop doing that. We don't need that information. This is not an international armed conflict in your traditional sense. We are legitimately in Donetsk, in the Donbas, etc. But we do. And for more than 3.5 years, we have not had a single direct attack on the UN. There's been attack and damage for some of our partners, including humanitarian workers being killed. But the UN has been kept safe, as long as we've stuck to the notification we've given. Yesterday morning in Kherson in the south, for the first time in my memory, the UN was directly hit. We had 4 UFP, World Food Program, marked trucks bringing in essential goods, medicine in this case, mostly, and hygiene kits. There was shelling going on. Fortunately, my colleagues who were on this, including the head of OCHA here, went to a safe place to wait out the shelling. And they parked 2 of the trucks just a bit away from the distribution point, and a few minutes later, those 2 trucks were hit with drones. And we always have to be careful to attribute. But I think it's pretty evident it was Russian drones that hit those trucks, and I've said so through my statement, and that it's a message to us. If you think you can rely on safety, think again. And that is a bit worrying. So far, in more than 3.5 years, the UN has been able to work in relatively safe ways. We need to see now what message Putin is giving to us with this one. Is that an exception, a one-off warning, or is it the beginning of change? Because and I learned the word impunity of states from you, frankly, because of your whistle-blowing stuff around Darfur, for example. And I think we are living in a time where there is a lot of impunity for violations of the global norms, including international humanitarian law. Someone said to me yesterday, well, if they do it in other places and get away with it, meaning it being disrespecting international humanitarian law and humanitarian and recovery workers, why shouldn't they do it here then?
I'm really disturbed and sorry to hear that the UN might be getting targeted after long years of not being so. Let's see what the trend is. That's the UN. What about civilians? You know what's happening in the Israel Gaza war with the countless deaths of civilians and in many other situations. And the normal argument by the fighting groups is, well, this is war. We try to limit damage to civilians, but especially if you're fighting in very, very congested areas like some Ukrainian cities or in Gaza, then civilians get hurt or killed. Do you think that argument is valid? Do you think the excess deaths of civilians in modern conflicts in Ukraine, is this just unfortunate collateral damage, or is this Russian policy to demoralize the population?
Yeah, I mean, in sheer numbers so far here, our human rights colleagues have documented that 14,000 civilians have been killed. And since February 2022, 50,000 or so civilians injured. So that's a growing impact and destroying civilian lives. Indeed, the Russian version, the way I understand it, of why are 14,000 civilians dead is collateral damage. They so far say, also as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, we respect that wars have rules, national humanitarian law. We abide by those rules. But even if you do, there will be collateral damage. I think, Mukesh, and I thought this when I was in Sudan and experienced the war there in 2021, maybe we do need to rethink international humanitarian law. Is it really okay to justify collateral damage, killing civilians with military aims? I mean, I think there is stuff that is very clear. Hospitals should never be hit, even if you suspect soldiers are hiding there. Your critical social infrastructure should never be hit. Energy should never be hit. One of the big concerns we have with winter starting is that they have done considerable damage to the energy infrastructure. They claim it's for military purposes, but of course, in a harsh winter, energy keeps people warm and safe. So this winter may be very harsh. I think we need to, as an international community, rethink whether the laws of war should not be tightened and whether the argument that collateral damage is okay, at least 60,000 civilians in Gaza, I think it's wrong to argue that way. If we want to preserve what's left of our humanity and the values we hopefully still all believe in, I don't think we can justify with modern technology and warfare the way it's conducted, that any civilian should pay a price.
Now, you were Gaza director in the UN, in UNRWA, and your heart must be totally broken by what has been happening. The Gaza you knew, with all the challenges that you obviously faced, um, was a lively place. And certainly now it's just a field of ruins. So, my question is about the challenges of humanitarian officials, and most of all the UN officials, when to speak up and when not to speak up. If you speak up, you get denied humanitarian access, and we've seen that in terms of what Israel does to those who speak up against Israel in the Gaza theater. And in your case, you have been outspoken in saying what's right and wrong in terms of Russia's conduct. How do you draw this line, this trade off? On one hand, you have to do your job with the consent of everyone concerned. On the other hand, you have to give voice to the terrible things that have happened and stand up for the values and norms to which you've signed up.
This is complex, Mukesh. I think we are both influenced by the Red Cross way of looking at things, which is it's really to preserve access to vulnerable people. You should do quiet diplomacy behind closed doors and rarely, if ever, speak up, because speaking up indeed will potentially jeopardize your access to vulnerable people or their access to your services. You know that in the case of World War II, as a German, the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, was at times accused of helping the Nazis by not speaking up about what they saw. In the case of South Africa, the same thing. In the case of South Africa, I think the Red Cross world was sort of vindicated when Mandela said after his release, "If it weren't for the visits of the Red Cross, I would have potentially lost my sanity." So part of what kept me going is these confidential visits of ICRC workers. And I know Mandela said if they had spoken about what they saw in prisons, they probably would not have been able to visit me. So I absolutely take on board that there are many situations where, as UN civil servants, as Red Crossers and a few others, we do need to be very careful in what we say. On the other hand, I think we've talked about this before. You were very involved with the Rwanda genocide all those years ago. I remember a public debate in Nairobi where the Red Cross and the UN were accused of aiding the perpetrators of the Rwanda genocide, hiding in northwestern Tanzanian camps that were managed by the UN and the Red Cross. And, the accusation, including from MSF at the time, was your neutrality and not speaking up means you're now feeding the killers. They acknowledged we were feeding the victims too, but also the killers. And I remember Jeff Lone, the head of regional delegation ICRC, saying in this public discussion, "We are never neutral. Why do you think we are neutral?" And you could have heard it pin drop for a Red Crosser to say we are not neutral. And he said, here's what I mean. We are never neutral in terms of the victims. We always have to stand on the side of the victims. And I think of that many times. In the case of Ukraine, I think it's clear the victims are Ukrainian civilians. And when it is clear that they are victims because of Russian aggression or military strikes, we do have a duty to say that. Now, so far, we've got very good relations with the Ukrainian side. The UN's access is not jeopardized in the areas controlled by Ukraine by speaking out. This would, in other circumstances, this is different. I think in Palestine, in Gaza, it's more complicated, unfortunately, because as you rightly say, the Israelis have thrown people out and impeded access. Does that justify not speaking up? I don't know, to be honest. I think I'm too far away from Gaza now to really take an informed position on, did we go too far in speaking out, and would we have been able to do more? You yourself have been in a situation in Sudan earlier where I think you felt the time had come to speak up, including, I imagine, that you considered what it meant in terms of access for the UN, but also for you personally. I think there is the access for the institution and there's the personal side. Whistleblowing and speaking up does have consequences. It's a long-winded answer, Mukesh. I'm not so sure on this one, what's right and what's wrong. I think I maintain there are situations where we should speak, and I think Ukraine is one of those. And I think there are situations where people need to be the whistleblower like you were in Sudan.
I think it's a debate that will continue, but with hindsight, one thing I can say is how the UN has changed in the 20 odd years since I was the UN coordinator, and now when you are a UN coordinator. Now, in my time in Sudan, when I spoke up, I was quietly or not so quietly eased out of my position, and it was more or less the end of my UN career. Now, in your case, or the case of the current generation, not only are UN senior officials speaking up, but they're speaking up very honestly and clearly and in a timely way. So I guess something has shifted for the better in the last 20 years, even as something has shifted for the worse in the last 20 years, which is a reduction in humanitarian access. And that, of course, is the dilemma. And if dilemmas had answers, we wouldn't be having this debate. But why at this time is the world of humanitarianism so angst ridden? And why is there so much disgruntlement with humanitarian agencies, humanitarian workers? I mean, politicians are dissatisfied with humanitarians. Public are dissatisfied with humanitarians. They're blamed for all sorts of things, being on one side or the other, or not doing enough, or many other ambiguities. Funding is restricted for partnerships are falling apart in terms of humanitarian partnerships, like the one, for example, I helped orchestrate for East Timor all those years ago. Beneficiaries are complaining also. What's going wrong? And what can we do about it?
So again, you're asking me difficult questions. And as you said, Mukesh, if we had answers to some of these, one of us would be a Peace Nobel Prize winner by now. There are no easy answers. You rightfully call them dilemmas. I sometimes say I get paid to stay optimistic and to advocate for humanitarianism, whether it's the UN or in my previous life, the Red Cross. And where I'm going with this is I think the reality is there are countless people who really, to the point of sacrificing their life, serve and are appreciated for that. We have 3,000 or so UN personnel in Ukraine. 75, 80% of them Ukrainians. And these are, selfless, dedicated peoples. The original humanitarian spirit in the Red Cross world, going back to Henry Dunant, all those century ago plus, I think it's alive. I think we need to be careful not to ignore the fact that there are countless people at community levels really doing good, and they are appreciated for it. I think back to your question, where have we gone wrong? Of course, the humanitarian world is not exempt from bureaucratization in 70, 80 years. So I think we've set up too complex procedures. You mentioned beneficiaries are complaining. So we have hotlines and complaints mechanisms, but then we don't act on them enough, at least. So I think it is back to the beginning of our conversation, this mix of bureaucracy that we need to undo. The current emergency relief coordinator for the UN, Tom Fletcher, is pushing a so-called humanitarian reset. Part of it is that. Let's slim down the bureaucracy. Let's go back to the essentials of life-saving and protection. And then a part of it is about people and trust in institutions. The humanitarians, again, are not exempt from the development workers in terms of the skepticism towards institutions. I think where we've gone wrong is to get too far removed from we the peoples as per the charter. And we need to find, if we want to survive, I hope this Ukrainian historian I mentioned earlier is wrong. We will survive because I think the world needs multilateral mechanisms to solve its problems, including not just war, but climate change. But to stay relevant, we have to do our homework, and a big part of it is regaining the trust through proper dialogue and engagement with the people we serve.
As we come to the end of our chat, Matthias, let's come to you personally. How do you rate your own contribution, professional, to society? You've dedicated over 35 years in the international sphere, and you've risen from the ranks to almost the top of the world's most iconic agencies, the UN and the Red Cross, Red Crescent. Any regrets around what you could have done more or better? And how many stars would be fair to inscribe on your future tombstone?
On the tombstone, that's up to others to decide if there should be stars on it. I hope there will be some kind of inscription that will acknowledge I tried the best I could. I think that's the motto that has guided you. Not I think, I know that's a motto that's guided you. We have to give it our best. Otherwise, we can't do this work. And I know this from the many conversations over the years with you. So there has to be a personal commitment. And I think if we don't see some results of that, whether it's the vulnerable people I meet in Ukraine or the Palestinians I served in Gaza, if there wasn't some kind of positive feedback that we appreciate what you're trying to do, I think we would lose the motivation and the personal will to go through with it. Someone, maybe you quoted it to me once. A mistake is only a mistake if you repeat it. So I know I've done some things wrong, including in Federation times. We've had some heated debates there. In some of those debates, I took the wrong position looking back towards you also. So there are regrets like that, but I hope that I've learned from things I've done wrong. I did some things wrong in Gaza towards the Palestinians. And, Palestinians tell me that I'm still in touch with. We appreciate that you've acknowledged the mistakes you've made and that you've learned from it. And so I think it's about that. It's, yes, regrets is about acknowledging we've done things wrong, but then positively moving on. Otherwise, we can't do this work, I think.
Well, on tombstones, my dear friend, I fervently hope and pray that it'll be a long time before we have to consider inscriptions, because there's much more for you to do yet. You can't get away that easily. Well, Matthias Schmale, United Nations Assistant Secretary General, and more importantly, a dedicated, lifelong international public servant. Stay well, stay safe. Thank you for being my most thoughtful and honest guest on Fading Causes.
Thank you very much, Mukesh, and I can only return the compliment. You have paid great prices personally for the way you've lived your humanitarian and development life. And the fact that you're doing this podcast and giving someone like me a chance to try and explain what it's all about is really hugely, hugely appreciated. Thank you.